And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Radio Network at coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course the original mothership at coalitionradio.us. We've got about 6 or 7 years or so of interviews, podcasts, articles, stuff. We've moved that up to coalitionradionetwork.com. And we welcome you to tonight's programming. Very special guest tonight. He has appeared in the Coalition before, but not in. It's been a while, sadly, and I don't know how that happened. Eric Boehm is a reporter for Reason magazine. His work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the National Review, Freeman, the Inquirer, the Spectator, the Examiner, the Daily, Fox News, pretty much everywhere. And he's a powerful voice, if you will, for what I'll call small libertarian thinking, as is Reason magazine. They are independent, if you will, of the Libertarian Party, but certainly endorse the notions of small government, personal liberty, and have an astounding way of sort of tweaking, if you will, the powers that be, particularly those that claim to wear the mantle of the libertarian movement. Eric, listen, thanks again for joining us on short notice like this. You wrote an article a few days ago, and your work gets a lot of eyes on it. It's great stuff. You managed to make accessible a lot of the issues of the day. One of the great litmus tests for a writer. I'm not a writer myself, but I admire writers. I believe you to be one of those. But you managed usually to answer questions that people didn't even know they had to ask. That's great stuff. But you certainly drew a reaction when you wrote an article, if you will, and I'll let you explain, Lucy Splain. But when you decided to tackle the subject of now Governor, soon to be Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo. You got a little bit of reaction there, didn't you?
Well, a little bit of, I guess. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on, Pat. Always good to talk to you, and appreciate all the kind words about Reason, about my work, and I think we do a pretty decent job of covering things. This is, I was kind of surprised, I guess, by some of the reaction to this, and I guess just some of the attention this got, because in some ways I almost wondered whether this was something worth writing about, because Commerce Department is not always, I don't know, it's not the most clickable of government agencies, for sure, and an appointment like the governor of New Hampshire to run the Commerce Department under a milquetoast president like Joe Biden is not necessarily something that these days is going to light up Facebook or Twitter. But yeah, no, so I wrote a piece sort of summarizing some of her work, and the announcement a week ago when she was tapped by the president-elect to run the Commerce Department, and presumably she'll be confirmed. I don't think there'd be much of a difficulty there. And my conclusion, I think I stand by it. We've had some conversations, and I'm sure we'll get into this. Is that I think she's ultimately a better choice than some of the alternatives, at least now. I mean, is she a libertarian ideal to run the Commerce Department? No, the libertarian ideal would be that the Commerce Department doesn't exist. Right. But you gotta take it as a her versus who else might have gotten the nod, and I think that's kind of where you have to look at this from.
My mom in the 60s was the head of the Democratic Party in the small town that we lived in New Jersey. So it's fair to say that I've been following politics for about 50 or so years. I spent a lifetime immersed in it. I don't know if I've ever seen on, I'll call it a local level, a governor below, a level of vitriol and sheer loathing attached to a governor as I've seen with Governor Gina Raimondo. And, you compare and contrast it. She's good for a state our size. She's got an enormous PR staff, and they spend a lot of time, if you will, fluffing her up to the Bloombergs of the world. She's an acolyte of the Bloomberg organization. And to public radio stations everywhere. She's quite the darling, which is why she spends a lot of time out of state. And for us. I think the way that I try to explain it to people with a wry smile is that when our new president, Sleepy Joe, as Mr. Trump would call him, was analyzing who he was going to pick for commerce, he said, give me the 50 governors and rank them in if you will, in order of economic performance. And they handed him the list, and he read it upside down. It's the state of Rhode Island is a zombie state and is a failed enterprise on a level that is astonishing even by American standards. But, one of your tenets was there that she's not a progressive. So the first thing I want to say is, from your perspective, how would you define a progressive as an operating governor? What, if you will, creates the notion that she would be or not be progressive?
And I mean, I'm full disclosure, obviously here, I'm not, there in Rhode Island. I'm not following the day-to-day of the Raimondo administration or Rhode Island politics or any of that. What I have seen and what I've read and what I've, seen and know about Gina Raimondo as governor is that she pushed some actually before she was governor, when she was treasurer, she pushed some very important pension reform issues there, pushed an initiative, I think, to get a sort of a fairer assessment of the state's pension obligation, something that was, I'm sure, and I know was quite unpopular with the public sector unions and with a lot of Democrats in Rhode Island. I know she's also been an advocate for school choice programs in Rhode Island. Again, something that kind of bucks the sort of deep blue establishment that you would associate with a state like Rhode Island and with sort of the democratic politics that go on there. So I think that's the perspective that I'm coming from here, saying that here's somebody who has, look, sure, she's the governor of one of the bluest states in the country, right? By your admission, maybe the bluest or second bluest or third bluest. I don't know how you want to rank it. She's nobody's idea of a limited government, conservative, libertarian, conservatarian, whatever title you would want. Whatever the ideal person to be head of the Commerce Department or governor of Rhode Island, whatever. But that being said, I think she's got a record that seems to suggest that she's willing to push back against the establishment of the Democratic Party on some of these big ticket issues. And Rhode Island's a mess. Sure, fixing the pension system is one of the things that you got to do if you're going to get the state out of the budgetary and fiscal mess that it's in. And so I think, was she completely successful as governor? Was she completely successful? Could she have done more? Absolutely. But I think there's certainly a willingness there. It seems like there's a willingness there to buck that. And then again, just to go back to my previous point, which is, as head of the Commerce Department, look, she's not going to be making decisions about school choice programs. She's not going to be making decisions about pension programs, anything like that, right? But what she is going to bring to the Commerce Department versus what somebody like Tom Steyer might bring to the Commerce Department, somebody who's made his name in politics by being an environmental activist. It seems like somebody like Gina Raimondo, who has experience with finance, who has experience sort of and understands, at least on some level, the way capitalism works and operates. Again, not saying she's my ideal pick for Commerce Department or Commerce Secretary, but will she do relatively less damage than somebody like a Tom Steyer, which is who I think a lot of progressive groups were pushing for in the interim period between the election and Biden's inauguration. Sure, seems like she's a marginally better choice, maybe even more than a marginally better choice in that regard.
Yeah, and of course, we're to a certain degree, our tongue is planted firmly in cheek with this episode of the Coalition, because of course you're right. Tom Steyer, who I believe you could argue was never really running for president, he was always running for a cabinet position, would be and out now. I mean, just turn off the lights at this point between the Rona and the sheer ignorance of some of his policies. I mean, I don't know who's worse in a certain degree, and you might raise your eyebrows at this, but Steyer, who is just, I don't even know how to define him, particularly since he's made a lot of money by the same dreaded measures that he would abhor for all of us, or Andrew Yang, who claims in some levels to be libertarian. I don't know. It's the challenge we face, I believe, in America is understanding really the true issues with your garden variety Democrats. And you've obviously got the Steyers, you've got the Bernies, you've got the hardened progressives who really see government as a form of, if you will, equalization, of transfer of wealth, of pure quote unquote socialist ideas. And then you've got what I call the corporatist Democrats. And what's interesting, where I sometimes divide from my libertarian friends, is that I find more exigent evils from the corporatist Democrats than I do with the progressives. A lot of the progressive ideals are noble in one sense. They're trying to make the world a better place in their mind. That's how they do it. I've always been able to work alongside them. The corporatist Democrats, though, like Gina, are in a stealth manner effectively creating government operations programs that are consuming significant parts of the economy, if you will, not federalizing them, but in her case, making them under the purview of the state of Rhode Island. And as a result, the type of cronyism that occurs, the type of corporatism that occurs, I believe is fundamentally more challenging. And just to give you an idea of the quote-unquote evil here, we have something called the Commerce Corporation, which had to change its name, much like a guy kiting checks had to run out of town because their governmental predecessor was responsible for the infamous 38 Studios, or as we call it here on our show, 38 Special. They were responsible for that, ironically, under a Republican administration, by the way. And so rather than understand what went wrong there, rather than accept the fact that the skill sets necessary to be an investment banker in today's era simply don't exist to a large part in state government, and also understanding that individuals' personal money, if you will, taxpayers' money, their funds, should never be under the control of companies, of a corporate enterprise like that, for the purpose of state management. It's incompatible with everything that we believe in. She's actually taken that to an entirely new level. And what I mean by that is she has constantly tried to, if you will, put under the management of Rhode Island government, and by quite frankly her cronies, in increasing parts of the Rhode Island economy, in how they've handled casino gaming, and how they've handled right now the run up to the legalization of recreational cannabis, how they handle the taxation of medical cannabis, how this Commerce Corporation, despite the out and out consistent failures, has decided to engage in even more out of state big money giveaways to entice business, while at the same time completely ignoring, other than the usual job training programs nonsense. And so I believe that to be a much bigger threat than I think the flash in the pan failures of once implemented of socialist ideals. Do you see that in other states? Do you see corporatist Democrats engaging in that type of behavior?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's obviously connections, political connections, as well as personal ones between Raimondo and Michael Bloomberg in New York, who of course is no libertarian. He's a longtime nemesis of libertarian movement and of Reason magazine in particular. I mean, we love to bash him. I think we named him the most dangerous politician in America, or the worst politician in America, a number of years ago. And there's, obviously there are connections there. He authored a piece in his own publication in Bloomberg. He wrote an op-ed, or I don't know if it counts as an op-ed when you own the publication, but he wrote a piece praising her, praising her pick as Commerce Secretary about a week ago as well. And so for sure, those are all concerns. And I think those are things that really more so as a governor, really, you have more cause to be worried about those things than as somebody who's going to be a part of a federal cabinet where that's, obviously they're overseeing a lot of spending. They're overseeing a lot of programs within the Commerce Department, but the Commerce Department really is more of a bureaucracy. It's not sort of the type of thing where a governor is going to go out there and try to throw money around to make a name for themselves or something. You've got, and again, I mean, to your point about 19 studios, I mean, that was Kurt Schilling, or 49 studios, right? That's Kurt Schilling. That's a Republican administration. These are bipartisan issues in Rhode Island for sure. And these are things you see governors on both sides of the aisle do. I don't know. I think yes, absolutely, there are reasons to be suspicious. There are reasons to be skeptical, and her history in investment banking and any sort of cronyist connections that exist there should be probed, should be given due scrutiny, and certainly will be, I'm sure, as part of her confirmation hearing process. Again, I hate to always kind of fall back on the point, but like relative to the types of people that Biden could have picked for this spot,
Right.
For this spot specifically, I think she's probably a better choice than many. And if I had to give Michael Bloomberg a position in the federal government, I wouldn't want to do it. I wouldn't want Bloomberg or any of his friends and accolades to be there. But if I had to give him one, I think the Commerce Department's a good place to stick somebody like that, because you're mostly just overseeing rote bureaucracy. Although that hasn't really been the case for the last 4 years, but that's what that department should be about, if it exists at all.
Right. The reaction from Rhode Island is essentially twofold. By the way, none of it is pride in a gal from our hometown making the bigs. None of it. I can guarantee you that. And that's, I think, the reaction that certain people in the media, the conventional media, expected. Like, hey, let's have a parade. And we're torn between we're torn between two basic emotions, and I call it the De Blasio effect. The only support Bill de Blasio got for the presidency were people who simply wanted him to get the hell out of New York City. And so you've got this emotional rift. And Rhode Islanders, a good friend of mine, John, is literally, on one hand, he loathes everything she stands for politically. But at the same time, none of us want to say anything because we're afraid that somehow we'll screw it up and she'll still be here. And again, you talk about some of the things she's done. And I guess, so part of the reason we wanted to have this conversation, it's almost cathartic for us because we desperately want to explain to the rest of the nation what an out-and-out disaster she is. I'll take an example. There was a company that was kind of a hot commodity a couple of years ago called Teespring, and they had really refined. They were a T-shirt company and a novelty company, but they had really done some disruption in terms of how they handle the process on the web, and being one of the first companies to generate that sort of real-time turnaround on individual. A great company. What did the state of Rhode Island do? They invested in a couple of their competitors and gave them sweetheart deals to come to the state of Rhode Island. Teespring left the state. We showed them. If you, again, support of, ironically, whereas Gina Raimondo will absolutely trash Donald Trump given the slightest opportunity, right now, despite we're talking about fundamental common sense here. And despite the failure of 38 Studios for obvious reasons, right? There is the Raimondo administration and the Commerce Corporation is trying to take advantage of that Trump legislation, which allows you to essentially, and they don't use the word condemn, but to take away blighted properties and give significant tax breaks and particularly capital gains treatment for investors in properties in that area. We're on a path right now in the midst of the greatest physical threat in terms of corona, depending on how you feel about it, to be having a 9-figure state subsidy, effectively, of a soccer stadium. Are you kidding me? But it's across the plane, and that's why we're just so riven by this, because you've got a governor who sees corporate style bureaucracy in the government itself, adopted a plan and actually lit a fire to consolidate the entire state's, if you will, wealth transfer programs under one computer system. It failed for over 2 years, and you were greeted with the spectacle of Rhode Island citizens literally standing out in the snow to get their welfare check. So you see this, and to me, it's not just obsessing about Gina Raimondo. You've got governors all over the country who are now tying into Wall Street, providing that sort of great quid pro quo. Wall Street recognizing that there's a significant amount of money to be made in managing transfer payments, managing pension funds. There's a lot of money to be made off of state government, and these unholy alliances are created where all these other investment opportunities are presented to the lords of Wall Street. And we're pushed one step further, and it happens in education, where Wall Street's now involved in Morgan Stanley, organizations like that are involved in education. They've been running the pension programs for a number of years. Our pensions, even with the run up in the market, are a disaster. So I guess the reaction is we're screaming that, it's sort of like the horror movie. Don't go back into the house, okay? And when you fall down, get up and keep running. Don't just scream. Yeah. And we want to say that to the rest of the country. And I see governors like her. Yeah, go ahead, buddy.
No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I see governors like her as the single biggest threat in a governmental sense to this country, far more so than a progressive. I just... progressives come and go. They're it's if you look at the city of New York, every 15 or 20 years, a progressive mayor is elected. They fail miserably, and they're replaced by people who David Dinkins, God rest his soul, was a wonderful man. I lived in New York City at the time and was a horrific mayor, and was replaced ultimately by the now loathsome but then something of a hero, Rudy Giuliani.
Yep.
But the corporate guys, they're around to stay. Are you seeing in your travels, because you're following the entire nation, where do you think the corporatist, middle of the road, years ago we would have called them Kennedy Democrats, where do they stand now in the scrum versus the progressives?
Well, I think on one hand, they don't have the energy that they once did. And I think that played itself out pretty clearly during the presidential primaries. You saw where, Biden may be the exception to this. I don't think I would even call him a corporatist Democrat so much as he's just sort of a longtime political Democrat. He's just a piece of the political machine there, and a former vice president and all that. So he had a lot of name recognition. But I mean, when you take him aside, and I think it was pretty clear from the presidential primaries that the energy on the national level is towards younger and more progressive candidates, even older progressive candidates, I guess, if you throw Bernie Sanders in there. Look, when you talk about mayors or governors, that's a different ballgame, right? I mean, you're talking about a state like Rhode Island that's very small and deep blue, or a city like New York. Same sort of thing, more, large population there, but also obviously deep blue. The same sort of political dynamics just don't exist. I guess one of the things that I would say, and I don't want to be here as the the guy who's defending the corporate Democrats by any means, because that's not what I want to do. But I guess what I would say is that the pension issue is a thing that is a very serious problem in this country, and it's in blue states and red states and purple states. Everybody's dealing with this. But there's a number of blue states, Rhode Island being one of them, and Illinois, New Jersey, a few others that are particularly bad, right? That are really, really on the leading edge of this. Mm-hmm. And I think you're going to see this become. It sort of went away as an issue over the last 6 years or so because the markets were doing so well, and that helped cover up some of the giant deficits that are there. It didn't fix the problem by any means, as you well know. I don't have to tell you that. But what it did is it just sort of covered up the problem because we didn't see these huge losses year over year. That is on the back end of the pandemic. That is going to be a major story again that state governments are going to have to deal with. And especially if you've got, presumably slower growth for the next decade or so, because the country is dealing with staggering amounts of debt. There's just sort of this compounding issue there. And so I think one of the things that you can say for the corporatist Democrats over the more progressive types is that they're ones who do at least look at that issue with clear eyes, right? Like they look at this as saying this is a legitimately bankruptcy inducing situation that states have their hands around or don't have their hands around and need to get their hands around. And I think the progressive types are more willing to just sort of, I don't know, we'll raise taxes on the rich and that'll fix the problem. That's their approach to everything. And that's not an approach that's going to balance the books in pension systems or in state budgets, or for that matter, at the federal level either, where you've got, progressive Democrats proposing, trillions of dollars in new spending when we're already trillions of dollars in debt. So again, all the cronyist issues exist. All those things are very real and very concerning and should be worried about, and people should be criticized who engage in any of that stuff. But I think there is some sort of like fiscal clarity that exists with some of the Raimondo or Bloomberg type Democrats that is just completely missing on the progressive wing.
Last question, because I know you have to go, and I want to also give you a chance to engage what we lovingly call here shameless self-promotion. You know, I had the opportunity to engage in a back and forth with the governor at a recent press conference, and you know, I constantly chide her for the lack of, if you will, shared suffering, shared consequences as a result of what's happening in America. I often posit that government workers are actually the true 1% in this nation because they are inoculated from any real pain. She, of course, countered that and I cited specifically the fact that our budget actually went up this year, despite, well, hello, we're waiting for the final sales tax numbers and tax numbers for the year, but I'm thinking that it's going to be pretty ugly. There have been no budget cuts. There's this constant, I call it the waiting for the governmental Godot, where, they're waiting for the next, bailout. And she countered, if you will, and I find this fascinating, I love your reaction to this, that austerity budgets don't work. And she alluded to indirectly situations like Greece, for example, where, certain economists argue that when you go into austerity, you actually create this if you will, whirlpool-like effect. What did Perot call it? That giant sucking sound? So that it was, in fact, she sees, and here's a mainstream, if you will, corporate-style Democrat, she sees government spending as fundamentally the tool with which to spin up the economy. And that austerity budgets, of course, the problem is on the state level, you can't print money, the last time I checked. But do you see any appetite in this regime, if you want, on a national level, or even at any state level, to engage in any austerity whatsoever in reaction to what is clearly a terrible economy?
There has been some, not in blue states, obviously, but there has been a little bit. I wrote a piece, this was several months ago now, about lawmakers in Utah. And one of the things that they had done wisely, and there aren't enough states that do this, and this is another thing that I've written about a few times over the years, actually, is that Utah does mandatory budgetary stress testing. It's something that they do, I think, every 5 years, every 6 years, something like that. Where they go through and they basically have a plan that the lawmakers put together, and they say, well, if there's a major crisis or an economic downturn or something that causes tax revenue to crater, here are the things that we cut first. Like, here's the first steps that we take, budgetarily, not talking about emergency response or getting vaccines out or anything like that, but just purely an exercise of legislative budget making. Like, what do we do first? And so when this crisis hit in Utah, they pulled out those plans. They immediately cut something like, I'm going to get the numbers wrong because I don't have it in front of me, but it was something like 8% of their government budget for the year was cut immediately. And then it was, we'll fill it back in later if the money is there. And if it's not, we'll figure things out as we go. And Utah and a number of other, states that took similar sort of conservative measures seem like they're going to come out of this with, relatively small budget shortfalls. Pretty much every state is going to face some sort of a budget shortfall, but the question is it a small enough one that you can just refill it next year with the expected tax revenue once the recovery happens? States that obviously were operating already in a shortfall or already with big deficits, or that were papering over deficits so that they technically balance the books, those states are in much worse shape. And so you do have, one of the consequences of Democrats taking control of the Senate, winning the White House, is that you probably will see some sort of large state bailout from D.C., which is something that we at Reason have criticized every time the Democrats have proposed it over the past, whatever it's been now, 11 months since the COVID pandemic hit. And it's something that I think will almost certainly be, it's something that Biden has proposed in his new COVID bill. And it's something that Congress will certainly be more inclined to take a look at this time around. So I guess that's a lot of this is being prepared for these types of crises before they hit. You don't necessarily know what the crisis is going to be, but something is going to come along eventually. And it's about, budget making is about setting priorities and about recognizing, when you need to cut. So if that's the case, if she hasn't taken those steps, if the Rhode Island legislature hasn't taken those steps, I'm glad there's somebody like you there, Pat, to ask those questions and make that point, because that's important. No. And there's a difference. I think it's also important. There's a distinction to be drawn between that type of preparation, right, and that sort of reduction in spending that's done as a precautionary move, and austerity, which is immediately what progressives and Democrats, and even some Republicans for that matter, go to when you start talking about cutting the budget. Is, oh no, that's austerity. That's austerity. And no, it's not. It's just like cutting back to make ends meet. for a year or two and then reassessing once the crisis passes. Right. I think that's a very different thing, and we shouldn't conflate those two.
Right. And in closing, her reaction has been to, and in conjunction with the legislature, has been to increase the budget over the last couple of years, impose truck tolls on a tiny little pass-through state, increase all sorts of nuisance taxes, giving away now free community college education, and on and on and on.
I guess in Rhode Island, you sort of have the two sides of that coin, right? I mean, on one hand, you can tax everybody that comes through the state because you got a lot of people passing through from other places and going to other places. On the other hand, it's really easy to get out of Rhode Island if the taxes go up too high. You can move down the street, you're in a different state.
Right. And listen, what we really need is folks like you, and grab a couple people from FEE and Mises to engage in what I call an economic intervention, which is to, and I can't even joke about this anymore, but let's just say we'll drop by parachute some Rothbard or something on these people. Maybe a couple of them will read it, because the economic illiteracy in well-educated, and Gina Raimondo is a Rhodes Scholar. She's an incredibly well-educated individual, brilliant. Yet to engage, on a corporate level on this redistribution, reallocation, shifting of the economy to the public sector is astonishing to me. And I guess in closing, that was why everybody went, what? And you're right. Your article did not promote Governor Raimondo. And I think and I appreciate you taking the time tonight to just sort of define the parameters of what you were trying to accomplish and what you did accomplish there. Now, tell folks, because it's been a while since we had you on the air, how they can, find you. Give us a little plug for Reason, why it should be, regardless of what your political discipline is, Reason should be required reading when you get up in the morning with your Wheaties. Tell us about how they can find you.
Well, you can check us out online, obviously, at reason.com, reason.com. We're on Facebook and Twitter and all of that. You can follow me on Twitter at Eric Boehm 87. You can hear all of my various little thoughts that pop into my head during the day. And I guess I will say, just to your hardcore libertarian listeners, who I agree with, I'm sure, on 95% of things, the end of the piece makes the argument. This was originally the top of the piece, but it had to get moved down because it just didn't make sense at the top. But the end of the piece makes the point that the Commerce Department really ought not to exist at all. And the best thing we can hope for in the next 4 years, or in any 4 years in the Commerce Department, is that we just don't have to think about it, right? So that's the goal. Let's maybe we get there. I'm doubtful we get there, but that's what I hope for.
Excellent. Eric Boehm, you've got a piece coming out tomorrow. I believe you said that if you could just tell us the title, and then we'll make sure it gets on the reading list here.
Yeah, the piece out today, because the reason we take shots at all the administrations, right? We don't like anybody in charge. And so I have a piece out today that's just sort of a nice little retrospective of President Donald Trump's failed trade war over the past 2.5 years and the various messes and problems that has caused. And then tomorrow we'll shift gears, and Biden is going to be inaugurated. So we'll have a piece that looks at, we'll have a bunch of pieces by a number of different writers at Reason looking at some of the things he's proposing to do in the first 100 days, including raising the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour in the middle of an economic crisis, which is just, it's an absolutely nutty idea.
Right.
It doesn't make any sense. And good luck telling people, businesses in rural, poor parts of the country, that they have to start paying people $15 an hour. That'll go over real well, I'm sure.
So what you're saying then is there's going to be a few hours in the early afternoon where people might need a safe space and intervention or someplace to go and read, what they should do is turn off the coverage and go up to reason.com. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. I can tell you this, we've got a bet going internally at Reason about how many times we're all going to roll our eyes tomorrow at the various media coverage of Biden's inaugural stuff. On one hand, I think we're all pretty happy to see the current president head for the door. And on the other hand, we are already girding our loins for what's going to come next and the sort of slobbering that will come from the media over tomorrow and the days to come.
All right, so an eye roll gets a shot of tequila, and a raised eyebrow gets what? A little anisette? How about that?
Yeah, that sounds good. Actually, I'm going to have to hit the liquor store tomorrow morning and make sure I'm stocked up for what's going to come, because it's going to be a mess. So anyway, you should follow all of us on Twitter. I'm sure it'll be an entertaining day tomorrow.
Fair enough. Eric Boehm, of course, he is a writer for Reason.com. He's a writer's writer. I'm hoping that we're going to have him on the show more often. And Eric, as always, there's an open door for you, and we appreciate you taking the time to perform our own little intervention here tonight in Little Rhodey and in New England, where, quite frankly, if you think about libertarians in New England, there's an analogy that can be drawn with the early Christians in the in the Lions. So we appreciate you spending time with us tonight. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Pat. Always good to talk to you.
We are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage, porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Radio Network. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty, mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, the old mothership at coalitionradio.us. We're going to sign off for tonight, but we thank you for joining us tomorrow night, 7 o'clock. Ramp. Real Access Motivates Progress. And then afterwards, again, we might have a little encounter session tomorrow night, a little yoga, a little hot yoga, something to get us through the day. Thanks for joining us tonight. Have a wonderful evening. Stay safe. And as we always say, take it personally. Good night.